I think it's less of the value than the significance.
Sure.
The argument is not about whether God exists. It's not even about whether Christianity has been a good or bad thing, although I think that the values by which we judge whether it's good or bad are themselves broadly Christian. But this was a perspective that I was not entirely given to embracing. And that goes back essentially to my childhood, as I think for so many people's relationship to this issue does, because it's very personal. I think that in itself is a measure of how significant the influence of Christianity is on us, actually, the degree to which we are shaped by it from our childhoods. But as a child, I was brought up an Anglican. I went to church, I sang in the choir, I went to Sunday school. But to be honest, I found it kind of dull. The thing I really enjoyed, the thing that really kind of got my blood moving was the classical world. And I liked it for the same reason that I had earlier been obsessed by dinosaurs, namely that it was big, it was fierce, it was extinct. And to be honest, I would have, I was very much on the side of Pontius Pilate. The eagles, the togas, the glamour of it. Jesus, kind of slightly dull in comparison. I mean, a loser, really. And so it wasn't that there was a kind of a dramatic moment where I lost my faith. It was just like a kind of a dial going slightly down, a dimmer switch. And it was essentially blotted out by the sun of my fascination with the classical world. And so when I, in due course, came to write history, it was the Romans, it was the Greeks that I wanted to write about. But I found the experience of living in the minds of people like Caesar, people like Leonidas, the king who dies at Thermopylae, people who I had deeply admired as a child, kind of almost hero worship. I found it increasingly unsettling. Caesar was renowned among the Romans for his quality of clementia, his clemency, his mercy. But this was a man who, it is said, slaughtered 1 million Gauls and enslaved another, and was kind of cheered through the streets of Rome for it. And I began to think that actually these are so remote from me, so alien, that actually the kind of assumption I'd had that these were the seed beds of my own values, my own assumptions, probably wrong. And so essentially over the past decade and a half, really, I've been kind of maneuvering myself towards writing a book which explores where I think ultimately the values of humanism, of secularism, of liberalism that I hold actually come from. And this was a quest that was sharpened for me by writing a book about the origins of Islam, where I was essentially making the argument that a lot that Muslims believe about the origins of Islam are actually mythic, are back projections. And it was a repeated complaint of Muslim critics that I would never dream of doing the same to my own beliefs and values. Right. So in a sense, Dominion is an attempt to do that, to kind of trace the thread back of my liberal humanist values and to see where it leads through the labyrinth. And ultimately, it leads back to Christianity. And I've come to the conclusion that in almost all the essentials, myself, my friends, the society in which I live in, the whole of the West, is so saturated in Christian assumptions that it's almost impossible to kind of remove ourselves from them.
And you say almost that in the book that it's almost that it is so widespread that we almost don't notice it. It's the kind of water we're swimming
well,
in
the metaphor that was kind of on my mind when I was writing the book was, if the West is a goldfish bowl, then essentially the water that we swim in is Christianity. But then after I'd finished the book, another metaphor struck me when I watched the HBO series Chernobyl about the explosion of the nuclear reactor in the Soviet Union. And what you saw there, when the reactor smashes open, you literally see the air ionizing, so you can see the radioactivity leaking. But the point of the story, of course, is that radioactivity is leaking. It's reaching Kiev, it's reaching Scandinavia, it's reaching, the sheep farms of Cumbria, and people are breathing it in and being affected by it, and don't even realise often that they're being affected. I mean, I'm sure Anthony would perhaps approve of the comparison of Christianity to radioactivity, But I'm not saying that
No.
Christianity makes your hair drop out and
No,
kills
sure.
you. But it changes you in ways that you may not appreciate.
And just quickly sketch out why that central idea, you say this in the book, is so important. You say the belief that the Son of the one God of the Jews had been tortured to death on a cross became so enduringly and widely held that today most of us in the West are dulled to just how scandalous it originally was. Why is that image so important at the centre of Christianity?
Well, the cross today is probably the most internationally recognisable cultural symbol that humanity has ever devised. But the symbolism of it has been turned on its head. What the cross symbolised for Rome and for those who were subject to Rome was the power of the greatest empire on the face of the earth to torture to death anyone who opposed its rule. And governors of Roman provinces had the right to burn rebels, to throw them to the lions, or to crucify them. And of these three fates, crucifixion was regarded as the worst, as in a sense being the archetypal punishment for a rebellious slave. And the reason that it was so horrible was it was physically excruciating. There was no one way of doing a crucifixion. You could be hung upside down, you could be impaled, or you could have nails smashed through your bones. And to stay alive on a cross, you would have to pull yourself up and down, so you would feel the metal scraping against your bone the whole time. Birds would flock around your head. You'd be unable to beat them away. You'd be unable to stop them as they pecked out your eyes. You would be naked. And so hours, perhaps days of excruciating agony would be endured. But worse than that, from the kind of the Roman point of view, it would be public. You would be a kind of billboard advertising your own humiliation and the power of the authorities that were putting you to death. And so the idea that this symbol of all symbols should, in a sense, have kind of been upended, that from degradation, the notion of triumph, from humiliation, glory, from death, life, and that more than that, the idea that someone who suffers the death of a slave emerges to become, it turns out to be, in a sense, the creator of all heaven and earth and of all humanity. What that means in the long run is that it gives a dignity to people who previously would not have been afforded dignity by anyone. It embeds at the heart of the West the idea that the victim can triumph over the person who is victimizing him, and that the lowest of the low might in a sense be the highest. And these, in the context of certainly of Roman culture, it's hard to emphasize just how radical a concept that is, and therefore just how much of a kind of a detonation it is under the assumptions of Roman power. And the measure of how vast that explosion was is that now, by and large, we tend to take for granted that, the lowest of the low do have a dignity.
Fascinating stuff. I'm